I gotta close this down. Okay. Okay. Mm. my God.
Over to us.
What was that, Janice?
I switched over to can only chat with hosts and co-hosts because remember we were going to do that.
Yep.
Good morning, everybody. I know people are entering the conference as we speak. We have opened our waiting room so that folks can come in as we speak. We have a lot of registrants today, so currently we have a good number of folks, but we're expecting even more. My name is Denny Brennan. I'm the Executive Director of the Massachusetts Health Data Consortium, and I'm delighted to welcome Kathy Rowell, the co-founder and principal of HealthDataViz, who has been a member of our consortium longer than I've been with the consortium, and with whom we've had the pleasure to work over the last 10 years of my experience and longer, and to watch how Kathy's pioneering work and HealthDataViz's pioneering work in visualization is suddenly becoming so enormously not only relevant, but critical in so many places to understand the complex health data that are presented to us daily is more than simply arraying graphs and charts. It's telling a story. If we can go to the next page, Lynn. Just for today's webinar, a couple of rules of the road and some social media information. Please feel free to use social media. You can see our Twitter handle. You can see HealthDataViz's handle, as well as hashtags. We have MHDC HealthDataViz and Mass Health Data as hashtags. If you are tweeting, those will assist you. Couple of rules of the road for the presentation. We're going to mute everybody during the course of the presentation. Please send your questions directly to Janice Karen via the chat feature on Zoom. And over the course of the presentation, we'll compile your questions and we'll, as politely and as discreetly as possible, interrupt Kathy occasionally to say there are folks who have questions of you. Also, we'll have time at the end of the presentation to have questions then. We are recording today's webinar, so if recording is something you're not comfortable with, then you're free to say nothing or leave the session, but we do record the sessions to make them available after the fact. We'll also have a brief poll at the end or toward the end of the presentation for you to fill. It takes all of 10 seconds to complete, and we'd appreciate your taking advantage of that. Let's go to page 4, Lynn, and I'll wrap up on the intro. Many of you know MHDC, but it would be presumptuous of me to say that all of you do. We're the oldest organization of our kind in the country. In many respects, we're the only organization of our kind in the country. We bring together all stakeholders in the health data ecosystem: patients, regulators, payers, providers, associations, for-profit companies, not-for-profit companies. We're agnostic. Healthcare is a community, and we provide services that enable that community to move forward, especially as it relates to the increasing need for interoperability among many constituents. We provide data governance services through our Data Governance Collaborative. How do you collaborate around data and figure out what you need before you know how to get what you need? Exchange services, we merged with the New England Health Exchange Network earlier this year. We have analytics services through our Spotlight clinical and business analytics platform. And we have these webinars, interview series, and our CIO forums as a way to engage the entire community. Everything we do online in the Vantage Point series, our forum, and our webinars like today are available to the entire community. This is not a member benefit, this is a community benefit. But we do encourage you to consider membership in the consortium. That's how we make things work. But that's not what we're talking today. We're talking about Kathy Rowell, HealthDataViz, and visualization in demanding times. So Kathy, I will turn it over to you, and thank you all for allowing me that introduction.
Thanks, Denny. I can't believe that I've been here longer than you have, although
I've been here a pretty long time. I know. I was a little humbled by that myself.
I don't know if I'm humbled or something. sobered. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, so without further ado, let me share my PowerPoint and we'll get started. All right, so this session, many of you may have come to other sessions that we have done that have been specific about the best practices of data visualization. But this session is about design thinking and about how to create a process for pulling together great visualizations and applications that people love to use. Because what we found is that folks are floundering. They may understand how to use the technology, they may understand the visualization best practices, but they're having a hard time putting it all together. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. So, your time is precious. And so I had to think about why would people be interested in this? Because the signups were pretty impressive, which is deeply gratifying that people are interested in this topic and want to learn more. And as I thought on our client work and, the things that we've been doing lately, it occurred to me that this is the picture that always comes into my head. This is what our clients are sounding like and looking like when they knock on our door for some help. It's like, we've been out here with our Viz tools, we've been out here with our data, we've been having a whole lot of fun, but now we're in a hot mess and it's not cute anymore. And we got to clean it up because there's nothing of value that we have created. It's just a tangle. So while we were having a lot of fun, we didn't really have a roadmap for how to do this efficiently and effectively to create something that people really wanted at the end of the experience. So I'm guessing in part, some of you may be joining for that reason as well, right? Maybe you got a few good things that are useful, but you're kind of in a bit of a mess, perhaps in some ways, or maybe you're just curious about, what is this whole idea of design thinking and how might I use it? So this webinar, as I mentioned, is not about the best practices of HealthDataViz, right? We've done those many times and we teach those classes when we continue to. We wrote about those in our new book that we put out. But in this book, we also, in section 1, first and foremost, talk about establishing a framework and a process. And this is where we give our nod to design thinking. And in the words of the famous Edward Deming, who is responsible for things like statistical process control charts, Deming said, if you can't describe what you're doing as a process, you don't know what you're doing. And although that sounds very provocative, it's actually pretty true, right? If we can't describe how we arrive at our interactive visualizations and how we get data and information out there in a useful way, how we tell stories with our data, then we don't really know exactly what we're doing, right? We're just gotten lucky, most likely. So that's where design thinking comes in. And it's a hot term lately, and we know that, and that's okay. Everybody sort of cocks their head a little bit if they haven't heard it before, and they say, well, we're not exactly sure what that means, but that's what we're going to talk about today and how we apply these techniques to the work that we do, and we hope that you will be able to as well. So one of the most famous examples that once you start reading about design thinking and you immerse yourself in the world of design and human cognition is the Norman door. And there's lots of great examples out here, but Don Norman is the one who writes about these Norman doors. And essentially what he talks about is when something is not obvious or is contrary to how we interact with things in our world. So when you see a handle on a door, your natural inclination is to pull, but you're getting a mixed message that says push. And what Don Norman says is, why do doors need instruction manual? Why not make it obvious? And so when you look at a door that's well designed and you push it, there's a faceplate. And when you pull it, there is a handle. And there's a term for this in design thinking and in design, and it's called affordance. And this type of affordance is explicit. It's obvious to the human, to humans, and to how we interact with things. And so it provides a prompt, this affordance provides a prompt about what we can do with this object that's in front of us. And so if you're creating a great design for how we interact in the world, you're going to have a push on a plate on a door, and you're going to have a pull handle when you need to pull a door. And we've all been in those circumstances where we're having this cognitive dissonance of, it says push, but the handle makes me want to pull. There's also affordances that are implicit or hidden, and we're starting to see, or we're not starting, we have these especially in our graphical interface design. So things like websites and our data visualizations, how we do things on our phone in different applications. So one simple example of this is these affordances, many of them are hidden. So we know that if we hover over, something on a toolbar, that something else will show up. We click and something will happen. So it's not entirely obvious that if I hover over something on this toolbar, something else will pop up. But we've learned and we've been trained over time, we know to do those things. So even though they're hidden, those are affordances that we know how to use. And so as technology evolves and people evolve, our designs have to evolve with those things. So let me show you a few examples of the things that happen and that we interact with, day in and day out in our world that will bring home, I hope, some of this idea of design thinking and how design evolves and how it evolves as we evolve as well, and how we learn to use the technology. So let's think about the telephone. So 1876, we have our very, primitive phone. And then in 1905, we moved to the candlestick phone that has a handle you can hold the mouthpiece up and you listen to the earpiece. The 302 phone was based on the affordance of, if you put your finger in, you can turn a dial and there are letters versus numbers. Then we moved to the letter number. And then the Princess phone was a huge leap in 1959. And then the trim line is very interesting because not only is it everything in one place, the keypad isn't on the mechanism itself, it's in the handle. But the other thing that's really interesting about it is the pound sign was just designed in for some unknown future use. Now we know we use that pound sign all the time, right? Enter your credit card number. You enter your card number, you hit pound. That says, I'm done entering my number, etc. So these designs have evolved over time, and it's how we interact with things, how we learn to interact with things, and then thinking about how we might interact with things in the future. And then in the 80s, of course, we moved to the cordless phones, and Michael Douglas in Wall Street, that was, great is good. That was a high symbol of, advanced technology and money, right? And you could carry around this shoe-sized phone with you. Then we get the clamshell flip phone that we now think is pretty funny, but was revolutionary at the time, right? You flip it, you put it in your pocket, you can call people all over the place easily. You don't have that big shoe anymore. Now you can put it right in your pocket. And then along comes the iPhone, right? That changes everything. And Stephen Jobs, rightly so, is held up as the genius who thought these things up, but it's Jonathan Ive who designed them, right? He made these things a reality. And how did he do that? Well, through understanding human cognition and being able to implement Jobs' vision of how these things could work and designing them in a way that they did work and they were adopted because people caught on so quickly. So these things evolve over time and they will continue to evolve. And so the other thing is that affordances come in lots of different ways. So when you look at your iPhone or your smartphone, an affordance is those little graphical pictures. And if you touch it, something that will happen that looks like a calendar will show up, or or your camera will show up. And these are all affordances that have been developing over time as the technology has developed as well. The Amazon website is another really interesting one in a different space, and that is these interfaces that we use all the time now. So back in 1995, and it was just Amazon Books, it was just this very sort of flat screen with some blue hyperlinks to other things. In 97, over on the right-hand side, they start to bring in more graphical images. There's more linkages on the left-hand side. Things are more organized. In 2000, they moved to all these tabs, right? And perhaps this was like the tabs that we see in Excel or in, Power BI books or one of those things, but lots of tabs. And then in 2008, luckily the tabs disappeared and we're back to this left-hand column where people can see what's they can select from, and then some information comes along. But now think too, as these websites and these tools are starting to develop on the internet, we have the ability also to have technology with things like eye tracking. So how do we look at these screens? And this is from the Don Norman and Nielsen's consulting group, where they do and have developed a lot of these techniques. So what they do is they're able to monitor and track where our eyes look on a screen. And where you see the hot red, that's where people look first. And so you'll see that we tend to look in an F pattern, and we start at the top left, we sort of look to the right, kind of in the pattern that we read. But there's not a whole lot going on that we're looking at in the lower left column and the lower part of the page, but our eyes are right sort of smack in that space in an F kind of pattern. And so how do we use that in design? How do we use that to make it easier for people to use what it is that we have created, right? Don't make them switch to what it is that you think should happen. How do humans, what is our cognition? Where do we look? And then how do we align the systems and services and products, everything in our world with this human cognition? And so you'll see in 2012, we start to see things like product buttons. So now the affordances are things like, well, you can search in the top bar. You can see that this is the little cart icon. That's another affordance, right? A cart means, oh, I know a shopping cart. I know that in my real world. I read from left to right. I'm looking in this add F pattern, and right in my line of sight is add to cart, right? So they're using and leveraging what they can study about how we interact with all of these things to make them better for us. And now you'll see as well that even these are streamlined a little bit, and there's more white space, less busy, and I can look and add to cart or buy now. And again, my search bar's at the top. So these things evolve so that we will do something, right? We will understand something. We'll take that call to action to put something in our cart. And this is all in alignment with design thinking. So graphics and languages we see more and more as affordances, not just the things that are explicit, but more implicit. So we have interface icons and action buttons and fields where we can type and ask things. We have notifications that come to us. Hey, you left something in your cart. Hey, you have a dentist appointment. We have calls to action that are right in front of us. Buy now. We have helper text about what it is that you can do with these things. If you click this button, this is what will happen. Some of that helper text goes away after we learn how to do these things. So, those things are nice, right? Like we use our phones and we need them and we've come to rely on them. The internet is fantastic and we've come to rely on it. Some people rely on Amazon, some people don't. But the question is, okay, so does this all matter? And the answer is yeah.
Kathy, could I interrupt you there? Because we have
Certainly.
a question that really ties into what you were just talking about.
Yeah,
So why don't I ask that one now, if that's okay?
certainly.
How do you get folks to think about people with different needs or different learning processes or different ways of processing information than they do?
Yep.
Is it a different process for large general differences versus edge cases? For instance, if someone has a specific type of disability, since you were just talking about like
Yeah.
the evolution of how people look at things.
Yes, that's a fantastic question. So I could do a whole seminar about accessibility, and we talk about it in our book a little bit. But for people who have some disabilities, let's pretend that they have impaired vision. There are screen readers. And so what's really important is that this text that I talked about, right? The helper text or the titles are very, very clear, because what a screen reader does is it reads and tells you what is here. And so you want to make sure that those things are always extremely clear and well written. There's nothing like a great label, a great explainer text that tells people what is on a page. The other thing is you want, for example, that's not the only kind of disability. Sometimes people have fine motor skill problems. So a mouse might be hard for them. So when you're thinking about these things, sometimes alt text, tabbing lets you get to certain buttons, making sure, again, that the buttons are big and clear and you know what they do. Making people not click too many times, because that might be a fine motor skill that's tough, right? So I don't want to add to cart and then go to cart and then tell them everything, right? If I had a disability, buy now is awesome, because I click and it goes. Now, I don't know that that was Amazon's total motivation, but if I only have to click once and get what I need, that's great. If I don't have, if I have fine motor skills that are challenging. So there are a lot of techniques. It's a fantastic question. And then in data visualization, you want to make sure that you're not using color palettes that people with, colorblind can't see. The red, yellow, green is a big no-no. And we talk about that a lot in data visualization, but it's true for any of these sites where you want people to see and understand. So I hope that answers the question. And there is a ton more about that, but, great labels, clear action buttons, not too many clicks, think about screen readers, and think about how do I get people right where they need to be. And I'll talk more about that.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah, great question. So back to design really matter. Well, let's take a little walk down, a historical view. And even things like these ballots, right? So if you remember back to the 2000 election in the Florida butterfly ballots, that caused a ton of confusion in the hanging chads, the infamous hanging chads. So what you'll see is that even though the Democrats are listed in the second column on the left, you have to punch the third hole to vote for a Democrat. But here, if you punch the second hole, which is what you would think, right? Republican, Democrat, and then perhaps, cognitively, you think that's the third party, you would punch the second hole in addition to the fact that maybe you think it's lined up with something over here. So it was just a total design failure. And, some people think it cost Al Gore the election. Whether or not it did, we'll never probably know in terms of, how these ballots came in. But yeah, design really matters. What are people seeing and what are they doing? Another example right here in Massachusetts, some of you may remember in 1994, the Boston Globe health writer, Betsy Lehman, was being treated with chemotherapy for breast cancer when a data entry error prescribed her 4 times the dose of chemotherapy that she was supposed to receive, and resulting in her death. And so it's about the design of, systems that would let a human make a human mistake. So does design matter? Yeah, it matters. And what's important about design and the design thinking is understanding and learning and adopting a process and techniques to understand that we are human. We do have fail points. We do get cognitive overload. We do see things a certain way. We do interact in a certain way. And really thinking about those and building those into our design to make the experience good, in this case, make it safe, right? Make it of value. So design and design thinking really does matter. So let me show you another example, the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene epiquery and how things have progressed. So you may recognize, and this is fuzzy, but these first generation tools that let us explore some data without having to, write code. And so you would be presented, for example, with a list of everything that was in this child health data survey. And then you would have to click what you thought you wanted, right? And you'd have to remember what it was that you asked for, and then you would get some sort of result. And if might be in a table and you would have to decipher that. Well, if that wasn't what you wanted, you would have to go back out, or if you wanted to see it presented differently, not in a table, you'd have to go back out, you'd have to reselect everything, and then you'd have to commit and you'd get one graph. Oh, maybe you didn't pick something correctly. You'd have to go back out. You'd have to pick again, right? And this time you say, well, I want to see this and I want to see it in a graph. And maybe you get some opportunity to change things, but it was this cognitive overload that caused people to drop out if they weren't expert in these data sets or they didn't use these tools all the time. And these were for public facing audiences. And we all know these, right? Like you're really curious, you want to see something, you click, 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 right? Which is really tiring. You think you got it right. And then you're like, what the heck is that? After 2 or 3 times, you're like, well, I'm over this, and you move on. And that's not where we want to be. But the new technology and thinking about how people interact with this and who is our audience allows us to redesign this entire experience and hopefully make it more user-friendly, reduce the barriers to access, and really get our data and information out there. And so when we were working on this redesign, one of the first things we had to think about was, in part, who are using these things? Well, clearly expert epidemiologists and statisticians were using it, but they also really wanted to get things out to community organizers and the general public. Well, do they know what's in a survey and then how to choose? No, right? I don't know what's in all those surveys. I don't really know exactly how to choose everything. I don't really have time for a fishing expedition. I might want to know something, for example, about, children's nutrition. And so at the first swing, what we did was reorganize just to make this all topical, right? I don't have to be an expert in any of this. And then next, whatever topic you chose, let's show you everything that's available using a graphic display. And so here you'll see if I chose, I want to know something about children and their nutrition. These are the things that the survey captures about nutrition. Here are all the years that they captured it for. And I have helper text, available data for recent years shown below. Click a data point to explore an indicator. So you click and it takes you. There's helper text. Tip, use the population source to see a different group. Well, I want to know about adults, or I want to know about drug use or something else. And again, to answer this question about, accessibility, a screen reader can read these things. And so we want these labels to be very, very clear. Now, there are limits with this, but for all of this data, you can download it into a table and then a screen reader could read it. But I could then just interactively select something, right? Because I know to point and click, and an entire screen comes back that gives me, and I'm sorry, this is very little. I could go out to the tool, but in the interest of time, I won't right now. But what comes back is as I've selected that choice, now instead of onesie twosie graphs, this is telling me everything about the demographics of that group. Again, I'm sorry, this is small, I can go out later. And I can make changes on the fly. There's helper text here. I can make some changes here. I can scroll through and see by neighborhood, etc. I can even test statistical significance. So these tools now don't cause us to go in and out all the time, but we can do things right on the fly and see them change on the page. And that's because the technology has changed. The users have changed. We're used to our phones, we're used to websites. So now we can create these data visualization interactive vizzes that behave the way that we have become used to things that we work with interactively on our screens behaving, right? Make a choice at change, make a choice at change. Click on a button, it takes you someplace new and it's in alignment with what you expect it to be. This is a COVID-19 one that we created for the Urban Indian Health Institute. And part of the reason I love this is right before the webinar, I was talking to Denny about, gee, what have you been working on? And I said, part of what I love about this work is I get to learn about groups and things that I didn't know anything about, like the Urban Indian Health Institute that reports data and information about the health stats of American Indians and Alaskan Natives who live in urban areas throughout the United States. But again, we can have helper text that says, you know, click on this button and everything will change. Change the data type that you want to see. It's a drop down, it's a click. Click on a button and we'll show you just the counties. We'll show you a trend. It's all right here. And we can also bring in, you know, things that make this appealing and people want to look at it and use it, like beautiful artwork. So the technology has come so far, and whereas we perhaps previously just had tables of data or spreadsheets, or we had PDFs that were static, now we can do all sorts of really cool things with it, but we also have to understand, how do people interact with these things? And how do we make them want to interact with these things? So making it visually appealing also goes a long way. So you might be saying, okay, that's all great, but it's still sort of scrambled for me. It's very confusing. It's like spaghetti. How do I get from point A to point B to create these things that are user-friendly, that people want to use, that get the data and the story out there, right? Like, it's very confusing, and it is. You know, we often say it's almost like, you know, a 10,000 piece puzzle there, and all the puzzle pieces are blue, and you got to figure out how they interlock, and then you've got to figure out what is the picture, you know, that you're trying to present here. So that's what I want to talk about now is, okay, so what is design thinking and how do we use it? I've seen and I've shown you how things have progressed. I've sort of talked about some of the ideas here, but like, what is the process that I can use to get to that endpoint? So let's start with a term, a definition for design thinking. And I think the first words are the most important. It's human-centered, right? We are designing for humans who use things, and it's cognitive. We have to understand human cognition. And design thinking really is just a fancy term for a strategic and practical process by which design concepts are developed. But the real key is it's human-centered, and there is a process, just like anything else, and we need to learn and use that process. So design thinking it's an idea, it's a strategy, and it's a method, and it's a way of seeing the world. And so we want to see the world the way other humans see the world, and then we want to improve on however it is we interact with that world. So that's what design thinking is all about. But I love this from Bill Burnett and Dave Evans at the Stanford Design School. Get curious, talk to people, try stuff out, and then tell your story, right? So jump in, try some stuff out, let people know what you're doing. And the other thing I want to say to folks is, this is not a passing fad, right? Like, we always have some fad that's sort of coming and going, and it's not. This is really very much where we're going to see a lot of folks getting trained, a lot of folks getting hired, that we need these people to help us out. MIT has a master in design thinking. They also have executive coaching. Penn has design thinking for health. Stanford has the D School. Radford College in Virginia has an MFA in design thinking. So this is a real thing. And these people are going to be, they're already hot commodities, but this is a real thing. And it's important, think about Betsy Lehman as just one example, design thinking for healthcare. How do we reimagine and redesign healthcare to really meet patients in their families where they are and what they need? So this is a real deal. All right, so what are the fundamental steps in this process? First and foremost, and if you've ever heard me give these talks before, you know that I love to tell you there are no unicorns. There's no one person who can do all of these things. And if someone tells you they can, don't believe them. It's not true. And don't hire or try to hire people who you think can do everything. You really have to build teams. You need subject matter experts in the source data. You need statisticians. You need people who know the software apps, databases, web developers often. You need folks who understand the best practices of data visualization. And then, of course, you need your internal and external customers. You need, patients and their families, if that's who you're designing for. You need clinicians, you need folks in operations, finance, public health. You have to build a team. No one person can be expert in all of these things. And then you need to adopt a framework. And there are a lot of, sort of steps in the process, but the framework essentially, I think, can be fit into three big sort of chunks. Inspiration first, you have to understand the people you are designing for. This is a contact sport, right? You can't just sort of sit back and think, well, they're going to tell me what they need. No, you have to really go out and understand who it is that you're creating something for. And once you've done your research and been out there, you got to make sense of everything that you've been heard. And then you got to try out some ideas and concepts. It's not a straight line, right? It's, you sketch, you design, you come back around, you think about it, then you implement, then you bring your solutions to life and you tell people about them, right? You get people jazzed to use them and see what it is that you've created. And they evolve over time, just like the telephone, just like the website, just like phones. These things will evolve over time. But if you follow the steps, the first swing out of the gate, you're going to have a much better usable product that people will use. All right. And then there are steps and techniques in this process, in this framework. So during the inspiration phase, you need to research, you need to conduct interviews, develop personas, use graphic organizers. I'm going to show you all of these things. During the ideation phase, you need to do some prototyping. And then during implementation, you need to develop these things and adjust. You need question and answers. You need testing. Then you need to deploy these things. And then you need to pitch them. Let people know what it is that you have created. Because not everyone is going to be on your team. A lot of people are going to be using what it is that you've created, hopefully. So in the inspiration phase, it's quite simple. In order to get new solutions, you have to get to know the people, the scenarios, and the places. You are not, just creating in a vacuum. You got to go out and do this research and understand people, places, scenarios. And if I had one piece of advice, it's you have to find your curiosity. Get curious, dig, think, read, talk, get curious. Curiosity is your friend. So when you conduct your research and interviews, we usually almost always, if we're working with big organizations, we research the organization and the reporting hierarchy because these are very complex organizations, especially, medical centers or even health departments, even for-profit companies that may be doing this work. And then you need to talk with the individuals. So who is it that's going to be using this? You need to speak with them and interview them. And I'm going to give you some tips on interviews. And that may also include, families, patients, whomever it is you are designing for, you need to talk to them. You also need to research the experts, right? Like, what do I need to know about the stats in this data? What do the clinicians need to know? What's in this database? And then you can always talk with groups of people if that makes sense, right? Like community advocates or parents of children. So whomever you are creating these things for, you gotta go talk to them. And you got to learn about them and learn about the organizations or the structures in which they are trying to find information and make decisions. So let me give you, for example, of a graphic, and this will be familiar to a lot of you who work in hospital systems, or even if you don't. These are very, very complex systems, and this is just a simple snapshot. It doesn't really even do justice to how complex these places are that you may be designing, for example, management reports for. There may be at the top some hospital association or system overseeing everything, but there may not be direct line reports. These are folks who, negotiate contracts, provide expert services. This is the legal structure. And within these, there might be, 6 or more hospitals. Within the hospital, there's departments. Within the departments, there's divisions. Even within a hospital, there could be a hospital within a hospital, a cancer hospital within a hospital, a children's hospital within a hospital. And those have departments and divisions. This doesn't even address the clinics that may exist or the research bodies that may exist. But it's important to ground yourself and research and ask folks about, can you explain how these things are interrelated? Because as you'll see as I go through, you also have to sort of be in the state of mind about how do these things interact and how do people report up through? So what data do different people need to see within their scope and role? So especially if you work in a very complex system, even if you're, down here just in a department, there's some sort of hierarchy within this department potentially. And so just understanding that is a really great place to start. So do your research, understand these organizations and what it is that they do. All right. And then back to engage with people. And leading with what questions do you want to answer is not the kind of rigorous curiosity that I'm talking about, right? And more often than not, I'll say to folks, okay, what's your process? Well, I say to people, what question do you want to answer? Ixnay on that as the leading question. That is not where you want to start. You want to understand the organizations or structures that they work within, decision processes, and then you want to talk to them, learn about them. Have you ever started a conversation with, just tell me a bit about you? Oftentimes we'll look up, if we're working with big groups, we'll look up people's LinkedIn profiles, like what previous jobs did they have? What education do they have? So we have some idea about, how long have they been in this job? And then we say to them, tell me about your organization, your department, your project. Like, I am trying to live in their reality. Describe your role in the organization. This is not a job title. A job title from organization A, B, and C, and D could be wildly different based on how big the organization is, based on a whole lot of things. So although job titles might tell us something, I don't really want to know that. What I want to know is, what is your role? Like, what do you work on? What are you responsible for? And then help me fill in the blanks. Like, am I getting this right? Do I understand, who you are and what you're responsible for? Tell me about the decisions you need to make. That is very different than what questions do you want to answer. If I understand the decisions they need to make, for example, I need to make a decision about whether or not I need to add to staff based on the hospital census and my budget. I need to understand if we are meeting our patient expectation goals based on the survey results that we get. And then I need to understand, then I'm responsible for deciding about which initiatives we're going to undertake. I'm responsible to report out community health profiles. You get the idea. Like that is entirely different than what questions. And then, in data analysis and data display, comparisons are everything. So now once I start to understand, the organization they work in, who they are, what they do, what decisions they need to make, I'm like, okay, how do you make those decisions? What comparisons help you? Are you managing to budget? Are you managing to national benchmarks? Like prior time period? Like talk to me about that. Like how do you measure how you're doing, or what is important to communicate out to the public about, this trend? Is it, state to state comparison? Is it this initiative when we started giving vaccines and where we are now? Like, what is it? And maybe it's not any of these things. What else might it be? And then we get to, okay, tell me other questions that you want to answer. What do you want to know? What do you want to explore? And often the best way to do this is to have them share a story with you about how they sometimes use data to answer some of these questions, right? So tell me a story, give me a scenario. And then what frustrates you and what does the future look like? Now that I understand the world that you live in, like tell me what this would look like when I'm done helping you, develop this data visualization or interactive tool. Do not start with what questions do you want to answer. Start with these types of queries. Observations. So imagine that you get up and all of us, me included, are very guilty of, I get cloistered, I get attached to my computer screen, but we need to get up and we need to sort of look and see what folks are doing. We need to observe, for example, how do you prep for a meeting? If I join a meeting and I just listen in, I can observe the interactions, the questions that folks may get. I can see how they're currently presenting data. Oftentimes I'll say, send me your current report so I can see what you got going on. But be an active participant, right? You're just observing and you're learning. This could also be, I just watch you as you click around a screen and you show me how you use a report, right? And I can start to see where the fumbles are. But observe. This is a really great technique, and it's used in designing things all the time. Like just watch. What are people doing? You also want to uncover what are called mental models. And mental models are an explanation of somebody's thought process about how something works in the real world. So this is just a simple example, but it's things like, how do you run your meetings where data are used, right? They have a mental model of how they present these things. What do you talk about first? Then what do you talk about? Tell me about a story about how you solved a problem with data. What do you do when you're first looking at these types of metrics? Next, how do you do root cause analysis? So what is your mental model about how you do these things, right? And we all have them. The example I often give is how you read a book, a hardcover or softcover book, and then how you read something on a Kindle. And the idea is not to completely replicate the mental model necessarily, but to make it better, right? Like whatever it is we currently do, how do we make it better? And someone would argue, if you really like your Kindle, I can look up words and I can look up words automatically. I can download new books. I can, read it at night without bothering my husband. When I get back on an airplane, I'll be able to use it. So what is it that we currently are used to doing? How do we make that better? But you have to understand that. That's a lot of reason why things like medical records, people get frustrated because they aren't in alignment with people's mental models. All right. Is there another question at this stage?
Yeah, actually, I was about to interrupt you because there are actually a pair of questions that kind of tie into some of what you've just been talking about.
Certainly.
So I'm going to ask you the two questions together. There are still many companies that don't even have usability or UI design folks on their development teams. How do you convince them to go even a step further and adopt design thinking mentality and then necessary staffing? And then sort of related to that, a lot of the process you've been describing and recommending is labor intensive. Do you have recommendations for smaller organizations that perhaps do not have the resources for full user research teams or dedicated design resources?
Great questions. And I have a slide that I'll talk about this. Two things. One, the process can absolutely be right-sized, right? And we're not a big team. We're a team of 12 people, and we have a lot of projects. But we always take the time to talk to people. Talk is cheap, right? And interviews. But we also right-size. If the project's really small, you don't need to talk to 10 people. You can talk to 3 people. You don't necessarily have to document every single, piece of the organization, because maybe it's a small organization, but you still need to do some level of this. So we call it right sizing the process. So I think you need to establish the process, but you right size it. The other thing is about hiring UX, UI experts. I understand that, and they are a hot commodity. But as I'll show you going through, you can learn how to do some of these things using simple techniques. So it doesn't have to be wildly, wildly comprehensive. You really just have to establish a process, and I advise that you start using it, because if you don't, you sort of end up with that spaghetti. So I hear you, and I'm not telling you you have to have gargantuan teams. What I'm telling you is you should have a process, right? And you should have steps in the process. And it doesn't have to be exhaustive, but when you start to do some of these things, you will start to see a transformation in how you're able to meet your customers' needs. And I know that might not be a satisfying answer, but even if you start to practice these things and you start to get smaller teams to do these things, and you have a process and you have a project plan, you're going to see a world of difference. You're also going to set expectations. And I will admit, sometimes it's painful. People are like, just give me what I told you I wanted. But if you can get a good project and you can do this, people will see at the end, and Denny and Arlene and I were talking about this before this webinar started. We are seeing clients who said, just teach us how to use the software, give us a few tips, and we're having at it. 2 and 3 years later, they're showing back up going, oh my gosh, we're in a mess. And now we hear you, teach us the process, help us figure this out. So this is the stage we're at. We need a process. I hope that helps. I know it might not be completely satisfying, and you might be skeptical, but it's true.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. So create personas. So want to use your research to develop personas that represent users' goals. So we take all of our research and everything that we've heard, right? We transcribe it and we create a persona. And what we're looking for really is a persona is really, what are your users' goals? And you don't want to design for just one person, right? You're usually designing for a group of directors or a group of parents or a group of patients or a group of clinicians. So you take that research and you create these personas, and what about Michelle and what are her goals, right? And these are our touchstones. This is like, okay, have we got this right? Who are we creating this for? Remember, it's human-centered. And it's not one human, it's a group of human that we amalgamate into creating personas. So let's pretend that she is responsible for a big collaborative of lots of hospitals for a quality initiative. She and her team, it's a whole team. Maybe it's like a hospital association or whatever. So she is responsible for a big scope. And then let's imagine that at the hospital level, we have like our chief medical officer and our chief nursing officer. So they're responsible for just the scope of their hospital and some quality initiatives, right? So within that hierarchy, we're starting to think about and understand and record, for whom are we creating? And in consortium, there's lots of medical CMOs and CNOs. So we want to amalgamate and get a profile of what these folks look like. And these are our touchstones. We come back to these folks and these personas. And then another very simple but highly useful tool is graphic containers. So we have done our research, we have started thinking about what these folks need. We started thinking about what types of reports we're hearing them need, what kinds of data. And now we can just use these graphic containers. You can do these in Excel, you can do them in, PowerPoint, you can sketch them on a piece of paper, but now you're starting to lay this out. Think about it if you've ever seen a website sitemap, right? Here's the landing page. From there, I go here, 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 and here. If I click on this landing page, I go to that landing page. In the world of interactive tools, this is the same idea. I have a data dashboard at the highest level for my execs. I've put my little persona people there. And then if I click, I'm going to be able to get to this report or that report. And then the suite of reports for readmissions includes all of these things. So again, we're just documenting what's going to go where, the hierarchy, and who we think is going to use these tools so that we can, and their mental models, like if I click here, I expect to see a patient list, or if I click here, I expect to see a map of my town. This helps us to puzzle this together, right? And this is another piece of design techniques and methodologies. And, these are really, really helpful because also it helps people to see, oh yeah, you got all your bases covered. Yep, you're going to meet my needs. Yep, I see how these things would connect. And this is how we're going to be building these things out. So graphic containers are wildly helpful as well. And so then you start to think about these things. I use Excel almost like graph paper. And so if I know I've got somebody who's responsible from my research for a whole lot of hospitals in a system, I start to think about which way are these things going to go. I'm not worried about data yet. I'm just sketching and using, you could use PowerPoint, you could use whatever you want. Piece of paper. And if I've got one hospital, I'm like, okay, they're responsible for a whole bunch of metrics. So I'm starting to puzzle this in my head based on how people are going to interact and what they need to see. And I'm not just sort of going directly to the tool and saying, let me throw some stuff on a page. I'm really creating a framework, a blueprint, something that I can use going forward. So then I can think about scope, role, and decision. Let's think about that first person persona who's responsible for an entire initiative, and then think about, well, I sort of laid out how I think these things are going to go. I also know people read from left to right. I know that they see a blue underline. That's an implicit cue that if you click this, something else will happen. But here, if I'm looking at a QI initiative for sepsis on a whole bunch of hospitals, I have short-term memory. I don't want to go through each hospital one at a time, click, 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 high click rate to see how are all of the hospitals in my initiative doing. I want to see them in one place, right? And as I learn, I can see, all right, here's my case count. Here's my rate of sepsis per 1,000 days. So I can make fair comparisons between hospitals. I can see who had septic shock and who didn't as a percentage. Now I'm seeing something about acuity, perhaps. What was the mortality rate? What was the 30-day readmission rate? Did they come from the same hospital or different hospital when they are readmitted? At what post-discharge day are they getting readmitted? And where are they coming from? As the leader of a big collaborative, I can see a whole lot about, a whole lot of hospitals, and I can see patterns between. So I'm leveraging all of that work that I did in my research and thinking about this and sketching through to come to this place. If I'm just responsible as the CMO or CNO, I just need to see something about my hospital, right? So I need to see, with and without septic shock, what's my rate, my sepsis rate, readmission rate per 1,000 days? Has it been changing over time? I want to know something about the patients in my hospital, their age, their sex, the payer mix, how long are they staying? What's the mortality rate? I want to see by certain conditions. I want to see by the encounter, what encounters did they have before they got readmitted? So again, in alignment with those personas and their scope and the research that I did, now I can start to puzzle together something that is of value and use and in alignment with the best practices. If, for example, I'm designing for the public and I have to go from a novice to an expert, like we did with New York City Department of Mental Health and Hygiene for their epidemiology query tool, I've got to design for the novice who has no earthly idea what's in this data set, all the way through and getting progressively more complex, all the way to the expert who wants to test statistical significance of some of these variables. I can't do this if I don't do that research. All right. So research, observe, how do people use these things? What do they need to accomplish? What do they need to do? We get very caught into the storytelling of data. And that's great. You know, we use that term as well. But really what we're getting at is what do people need and want to do with these things? And then the story will come through. Okay. So how do these techniques help people? So personas help you keep the user's goals top of mind. It helps you think about how to improve the current process. It keeps us some self-referential thinking. What do I think is cool? What do I want to do? What do I understand? You got to remember, you're designing for human-centered other people. You may be a user as well, but you got to talk to those folks. And it helps us avoid what I call the 1,000 flavors of vanilla. Like, well, John wants it, but Susie doesn't want it, and Cliff wants something different. Well, you know, based on their scope, role, and decision, you should be able to get most of what they all need under the curve. And then, you know, the mental models and graphic organizers help you to understand what are the linkages. How is this in alignment with how people think about these things? If I click here, where am I going to go? Think about the construct of website, right? When I hit a landing page and I go here, where do I go? Where does that page go? Where does that page go? It's the same concept in these interactive tools. So this is the, I know you don't want to do any of this, or you think you can't, back to the, how do I do this? But you can. And the idea that you're going to get out of this maze by just jumping over the walls is not real. That's not going to happen. Just like anything, we are in the nascent stages, but you really have got to start to develop these processes. And you can do it. You really can. Just start small, but start to put these things in place.
Kathy, just a question or a comment. There's a lot to be said for a great deal to be said for the approach and the process that you describe here. And it's in some ways often counterintuitive with technologies that encourage us, however implicitly or unintentionally, to dive in. You know, the way Tableau can render a graph is just so cool. I can turn it into
your data.
yeah, I could turn it into this, I could turn it into that. But what you're saying, as I understand it, is there's no replacement for the amount of mental and cognitive preparation that you need to do before you dive in. It's almost a restraining function before you dive in. Know your data, know your user. You know the context within which you're operating, which is invaluable for so many technology related and data related professions, because we're often really tempted to plunge in and use these tools and render information that is, when we're finished, completely meaningless to us. So I think what you're sharing has application, you know, broadly, and I think that's a very good lesson. I don't know, Janice, if you had other questions or folks had something they wanted to raise.
Well, I have two questions I'm saving to the end at this point. So go ahead and proceed. I think they're good kind of.
Somebody in the chat
general.
might have another question.
Yeah, well, these are all the questions from the chat.
Cool. So yeah, and Danny, you bring up a good point. And you know, Tableau was originally, you know, democratize your data, explore your data, right? Drag and drop and see what's in here with graphs. That's true. But what that, you know, and sure, if you just want to put it on a data set and go in there and poke around, have at it, right? But if you want to create something that people use, That's not how this works, right? You have to do all of those things. So there's the difference, and I should have said this at the outset, right? You don't need design thinking for data exploration. Just have at it. Go see what's in the data set. See what, see what the trend is. See what, the distribution is. But if you're trying to create the things that we are trying to create out here with these new tools, you must have a process. Yes. Okay. So now, ideation. You've got lots of ideas. You've talked to people, right? You've got to start to work through how you're going to put this all together. As Denny said, like, what data do you have? You can just make a quick spreadsheet of this is what I've heard, this is what we've got. Or you just talk it through, right? You've got data dictionaries. Do we think we have all of these things? So what data do you even have? And then sketch. So I teach HealthDataViz and among other things. And at the end of the dashboard training now, what I do is I say to people, I will give you an hour each to take a look at what you're doing, and we can, redo what you've got, or we can, look at some new ideas for you. And no matter how many times I beg people to sketch, like walk away from the computer and just sketch, whether pen to paper or I just use Excel like graph paper. Like, don't worry about the tool you're going to use ultimately. Just sketch. When I get in these one-by-ones, it happened a few weeks ago. The gentleman said, "Oh, you just sort of lay it out before you ever go to the tool." I'm like, yes. And he's like, "Oh, I see what you mean. Like, now we have a direction. So just sketch. It's cheap. It's easy. You can fail often, but it's a whole different experience. And sketching is, there's research about how it changes our relationship with how we think about these things. So sketch, sketch, sketch. And then create your low fidelity prototypes. And there's several ways that you can do this. Again, I often use Excel and I just mock up simple data where I want to show a distribution. I can drag in some icons, but my team has become very good at using this tool called Figma, which is does the same thing. It drags and drops in shapes and whatnot. And what's great about this is you don't have to worry about having actual data. It's quick, it's easy. You can start to see what it looks like. You could do it in PowerPoint. You can do it lots of ways, but these tools are designed to help us just sort of see how these things might fit and what makes sense. So these are our low fidelity prototypes that we can create. The other thing that I want to say about this is mobile first. So I don't know how many folks are starting to think about mobile first, but we're starting to see more and more requests for mobile first. So the thing I would say when you're prototyping and thinking about these things is mobile first makes you really think long and hard about what must be on the page because you've got such limited space. But it also helps you think about how these things need to stack. These are the New York City Community Health Profiles. This is a continuous scroll for a phone. But it informs what it's going to look like on the desktop and how these things are going to collapse and move. So just FYI, if it's a requirement to have mobile first or tablet, start here because it forces you to prototype what really has to be on this page, how you're going to stack it or size it, and then you can more easily fit it onto these pages. So that's just a side tip about prototyping. The other thing about the prototyping is that in a tool like Figma, what's very cool is that you can actually record how this thing is going to actually work. So people can see, it doesn't actually work, it's just a wireframe. But for example, I can show that if you click on a state, then all the data will change on that page. And it will change back when I click on another state. So these tools are not expensive. especially we don't sell Figma, it's just the one that we use. There's several, there's some in the Adobe suite of tools, but these tools also let you, let people focus on the metrics, but not the values. How many times have we heard that data is not right? Well, it's fake data, right? It's not real data, but it lets, people not worry about the actual values, but look at the interactivity, the layout, lets you try different design ideas quickly and easily, your logos, how the interactivity will work. So these prototype tools really help you a lot. And then here's the tip, and it's a rule in our organization. You have to learn to pitch or explain your design and then invite feedback. And that means you never, under penalty of severe pain at HealthDataViz, send designs or prototypes out cold. Don't just shoot them out there into the ether and say, what do you think, in an email? Or show it to somebody and say, what do you think? You really have to show them how these things are going to work, what the trade-offs were, etc. Because it allows you to explain and, if necessary, defend the design and educate. If you just give these to somebody, right, they might not have any idea about what the data set is or what trade-offs you had to make or the limitations of the technology or what you heard from the people that went into design about what they wanted. So you, as a first blush, always want to have an opportunity to show this to people. And it's not just, well, you click here and it does this. You're explaining, right? The guided analytics, the interactivity, whatever trade-offs you had to make, the challenges with the data or the tech, why you selected one chart versus another. So you want to defend and explain what it is that you have created. Now, you're not defending, i.e., it can't change. It's defending, well, we thought about doing this, but it wouldn't work because of we don't have the data or whatever it may be. So always take the opportunity to show folks. And then the other thing it allows you to do is people may say, oh, well, can't you make that into a pie? Or why did you do that? Or, etc. In our book, the way that we set these up was don't use these charts, but also we gave you sort of the bullet list of why something doesn't work and something works better based on human cognition, best practices, how people see and understand data and information. So don't just sort of say, well, no, you can't use a pie chart because that's not a best practice. Explain, right? This is part of defend. Here's why these things don't work as well as these types of graphs do. And here's what this graph lets me do that another graph doesn't let me do. So it's all about like being in the game, right? Explaining what it is that you've created. And then you move to your high fidelity prototypes where you have some actual data and you start to really populate and move into what is going to be the final set of infographics, tools, exploratory displays, reports, dashboards, whatever it is that you have created. And you'll see here as well, when we think about design and we think about human cognition, you want these things to look the same. So, where are we going to put our logo and where are we going to put our navigation and our selection buttons, right? You want a cohesive look and feel, but also you don't want people to have to relearn every single time what it is that they can and can't do and where to look. So you're looking for consistency and you're creating these high fidelity prototypes. And then, the big piece that gets left out in our work is usability testing. And back to, this doesn't have to be complicated. I love these two books, Steve Krug, Don't Make Me Think, and Steve Krug, Rocket Surgery Made Easy. And these first books were really designed to usability testing for web. But he's redone these books, and much of what is in here is applicable to a lot of the work that we do and things that I've been sort of chatting about. But he also gives you techniques that are extremely low cost and easy to implement to test out, has what you've created really served the purpose that you were hoping that it did. So you want to learn, is what you've created useful? Does it do something that people need to get done? Is it learnable? Can people figure out how to use it? Is it memorable? Do they have to relearn it every time they look at it and use it? Hopefully not. Is it effective? Is it understandable? Is it efficient? Is it quick? Do people have to sit around for, 5 minutes, which is a lifetime these days, or does it return quickly? Is it what people want? And do they really even like using it? Is it fun? Is it easy to use? So how do we get at some of this usability testing? It doesn't have to be complicated. Refer back to your persona and what were their goals? What decisions do they need to make? What actions do they want to take? And then craft 3 to 6 questions, specific questions that you think people should be able to answer with what you've created, and see if they can find the answers, and watch how they navigate and record what they say as they navigate. This can be very simple. Just ask them, we've shown it, we've iterated through, we have, a final thing that we want you to test out before we deploy it to production, and record, a call with them, or post-COVID, go to their office and sort of sit and watch what they do. So for example, let's imagine that we go to this city health dashboard and we have created for folks, and we want to see, can they do several things that we believe they could based on our research and our design, etc. So we give them the website, and then we give them a list of questions, and we say, very specifically, can you find the percent of children living in poverty in Boston, Mass versus the national average? Can you define how poverty is measured? Where the greatest number of Hispanics live by census tract? On and on and on. But you will see, this is not, do you like it? This is very specifically based on our research and our personas. We believe you should be able to easily and quickly find this information. Now have at it. Can you do it? And you just ask people to test and try it out. And don't just ask them to try it out, ask them to try it out with a purpose. And you can, watch where they stumble, or they're going to say to you, I couldn't figure out that question. And don't coach them, just, see what they can do and what they can answer. So usability testing does not have to be wildly complicated or expensive. It's, what do you think people should be able to do, and can they do it? And then finally, people say, we created this beautiful thing. Nobody uses it. Well, 2 things. One, did they use it, but they found it too hard to use because you didn't have a process and you didn't test it? So yeah, they used it once and then they're like, that's too much trouble. Or do they just not know it exists? So interestingly, part of the design thinking process is let people know what you've created, like sort of get out there as a salesperson or somebody else does to let them see. Because when people see the cool thing that somebody else has, or the cool thing that you've created for them, they may not have known about, as another department head who wasn't maybe on your core team, you've got to let them know it's there. You can do this virtually, or you could do it in a group setting, but go on a roadshow, show and tell. Here's what we created. Here's why we think it's cool. Here's how we think it can help you. Back to the City Health dashboard. And I believe Mass Chia had also done this, but I could not find them on the website. So I don't know if they took them down. But also, some groups are creating just very simple 1 minute or less little video clips that tell people what they can do, and they show them in these little video clips. Now, this might not be something that you do in a big organization like a hospital group, but it could be something you do in the public space. It might be something that you do, if you maybe work for a big organization. But these are just little video clips that say, hey, look at this cool thing. And people will watch 60 seconds or less. So that's another way that you can pitch and do a little bit of marketing about what it is that you've created. And I can go out and show some of these to you, or you can go and take a look at them yourself. And you'll even see now on Amazon, right? You can see little videos about what is this book about, or what is this product about? So videos are also a great way to pitch what it is that you have created. So in wrapping up, stop hunting unicorns, establish a team. Team, team, team. It is all about a team who can do, lots of these different pieces of the puzzle. And I can't, say how important a team is. There are no unicorns. We have to learn how to develop and establish these teams. And then set a process and right size it for your organization and your projects. But get a process and get steps in a process that are logical, right? If you're just kind of all over the place, you're always going to be frustrated and you're not going to create things that I know everyone is capable of, really great visuals and tools that people want to use. So get some semblance of a process. And it makes me think of this cartoon, which I really love, the cow driving the plane. These darn hooves, I hit the wrong switch again. Who designed these instrument panels? Raccoons, right? Like, for whom are we designing? We have to know these folks. We have to do this research. And then here are some recommended reading resources. So Don Norman, this is the quintessential classic design of everyday things, fun read, talks about Norman doors and a bunch of other stuff. The Inmates Are Running the Asylum is my perennial favorite. It's a little bit of a slog by Alan Cooper, but he writes about personas and the importance of them and how, you can't just sort of hand these things over to, one person or group to say, here, go create this. Of course, the Don't Make Me Think, Universal Principles of Designs and Methods. This book has a lot of the methods I've been talking about, how to conduct interviews, observations, etc. And then, of course, our book about best practices of HealthDataViz, and we give a nod to this process and the steps in the process and personas, etc. So a lot of this is, educating yourself as well. And these are great books, and they help you to sort of see how these processes can work. So Denny, and team, I will leave it to folks to ask questions.
All right. Thank you so much. That was super. This is Janice. I have a bunch of questions. I have a few from this last section. I kind of missed my opportunity to interrupt you for one of them because I misevaluated how you were going to continue on the presentation. So one of these is actually from a while back.
That's fine.
Are you still seeing mobile first for B2B or enterprise projects, or just for consumer facing projects?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I would say probably not phone, but definitely tablets. So we're seeing more requests for at least tablet, but definitely in the public domain. Some of the projects are even just mobile first. They don't even want anything that necessarily would go on a website. One example is a malaria project where they're going to be reporting about behaviors around malaria in a lot of countries where folks don't have mobile phones, but they don't necessarily have computer screens all the time. So again, that's one of the depends, but definitely tablets, yes.
Actually, as a follow-up for me on that, just tying back to the question we had earlier, how do you handle the accessibility issues for those projects, given that there are more significant accessibility issues for apps on mobile phones than on computers?
Yes. Yep. Well, that's part of the conundrum, right? And so I will be honest, I don't know two things. One, the software for data visualization is not really there for 508 compliance. So it's a matter of the following, and that is oftentimes now what you have, if 508 compliance is a big must have, it's about embedding visuals into a website, writing some JavaScript that passes code back and forth to the web wrappers that are more accessible for reading titles and navigation. And so it's a hybrid approach. There's more to it than that. But that's one of the ways that we get at it.
Okay, great. There are a couple of more questions that are specific to parts of the later part of your presentation, and then some general questions that I was holding. But before we get to those, let's go ahead and do the poll for folks. So Lynn, if you could start the poll. And while that's going, let me go ahead and ask the next question, I think. So the next question is, given the steps that you outlined for this process, how much time, for instance, how many days do you believe it would take on average to build a meaningful report?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. That's where really good project plan comes in. It depends. It depends. So everyone says, no, our data is in good shape. And we say people lie and they don't know they're lying. So it's often not the design and the development of the visuals or the report. It's that underlying data that's going to hang you up. So let's say you had perfect data. You could create a really great report in probably, a couple weeks, 4 weeks. But if you really have gnarly databases and it's a big project, nothing short of 6 months. And I'm talking big projects, really big projects like New York City, that was 18 months. It depends. If you just need to create a simple report and you have simple data and it's in good shape, you can knock these things out pretty quickly. Again, it's about right sizing, but get a project plan and really think through, and always know it will take longer than you think. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you everyone for answering the poll. It looks like we had good results there. And then we had a question asking you to comment on the tyranny of metrics or red teaming.
I'm sorry, on what?
The tyranny of metrics or red teaming. Are you familiar with those?
The second term I have not heard.
All right, Ray, we're gonna unmute you and let you comment further. Hang on.
Yep.
I don't, there we go.
I'm unmuted.
Yes, sorry, it took me a while to find you.
Okay, the Tyranny of Metrics is just that book, which is quite popular among people who are being beaten up by their bosses to do these metric analyses. But
yeah.
The red teaming is also a book, but a concept, a process. It's developed and used by the US Army and the Israeli Army, of always having somebody in the room who's allowed, even encouraged, to ask the wicked questions. And the reason I bring it up is because the biggest problem, by my experience, in healthcare is there's a culture which is not exactly, hey, let's go and pitch in and divine something new, And one of the biggest problems is a bit hierarchical, a bit, I don't want to speak out of turn. And so red teaming sort of encourages this right from the get-go, to change the culture to ask the wicked question during the design process.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yes. I think a conundrum, I'll be thinking about that question for quite a while, so thank you. I think I think a few things about this. One is, I think this is another reason for your research and your prototyping, because it allows people to ask these wicked questions without the people doing the heavy lift, i.e. of the database and the design, et cetera, without sort of feeling like I put in all this hard work and now you want me to undo it, and like, what are you talking about? So it gives you the opportunity to just try and try again. And let people poke at you and kick you around and show them what will and won't work, and to ask those wicked questions like, is this really going to even work? Because what happens is, I think, oh, I don't think, I'm certain, when you go directly to the solution and you haven't done all these steps, and then somebody asks the wicked question, it's completely demoralizing, right? Like, I built this thing that I think is gorgeous. A couple of people said, yeah, that looks great. But now you're like kicking the tires on it and telling me, it's a terrible thing. So that's another reason for this process. And then, I think also one of the things I didn't talk about, but that we always say is, you need to have that final decider in the room, right? You need somebody who's going to say, look, this is what we can do with the data that we have, with the technology that we have, and we have talked to people and we've let you, kick the tires on this thing, and we've encouraged those questions, but now we got to birth this baby and know that, it will change again as people change, as data changes, as technology changes. So I think this is my long-winded way of saying, yeah, bring it on. Bring it on. You want to hear what folks have to say, but then you need a final decider who says, it doesn't matter how many times you tell me you want this thing to spin up and down and like give you the answer. It's never going to do that because we don't currently have the data. So I think I just gave you a sort of long-winded, convoluted answer, but yeah, but bring those folks in early and hear what they have to say, and then pitch back out about what you could and couldn't do.
All right, great. Thank you. I'm going to go back. If there are any final questions, please send them to me now. But I'm going to go back to those questions I mentioned earlier that I was holding for the end. And there are two questions that, again, are somewhat related to each other. So I'm going to ask them together.
Mm-hmm.
How, as you talk to people about design thinking and this process, how do you handle issues where people are stymied by their belief that something is so obvious it doesn't need description? This is sort of going back to those early comments you made about describing everything. I've run into many cases where people have extreme difficulty with this type of thought process. And personally, I know I had a class where I was asked to prove 1 was greater than 0. And I was asked to do that about 14 times because even though it was a really simple mathematical proof, people couldn't get over their mental block.
Yeah. I love this question. So it's really funny. One of the things that we'll do is internally we'll, on our own team, when we are working on something for a client, we'll test it internally. And sometimes, even our team will be like, well, it's obvious, it's right there. But this is the power of testing. Just because you see it doesn't mean I see it. Let me give you an example. There was a viz the other day that was beautiful, but when I looked at it, I was like, okay, I've been in this business for a really long time, but I don't know what that acronym is. Like I should know what it is, but I don't know what it is. And person on my team said, yeah, well, they know what it is and they use it. And I said, well, it's public facing. Public isn't going to know. And I don't know what it is. What is it? And so she told me, and I said, oh yeah, now that makes sense. I know what it is. I said, but I'm telling you, sure enough, as we tested it internally, that came up. And so we went back to the client and said, you need to spell this one out, because when they tested it as well, they were like, people don't know what that means. So test. Just because you think it's obvious doesn't mean that it is. And so that's where you have to just walk away and say, well, it might not be obvious. I was out last winter walking my dogs on the golf course, and this couple who was maybe they're in their mid-70s, they started cross-country skiing, and the gentleman fell. And then I could see, A, he couldn't get up, and B, they were trying to get his binding off by using the ski pole, right, to release it. And it would not work. So I said, do you want help? Yes. I went over and I started looking at it the way that I would always look at it, the way they were looking at it as well, with that ski pole. And then I said, Kathy, take a beat, design thinking. How might this work differently, right? Because this is not obvious to any of us. When I stood back, I leaned down and I twisted the binding, and then it came out. They thought I was fabulous. And I thought to myself, no, that's just design thinking. I'm trained to say, none of us are seeing what we think is obvious. How else might this work? But you know, maybe they should have bought different bindings, or I don't know, but it was slick and it made way more sense the new way. But, you know, either they should have been oriented to it or they were just lucky I was there, because I don't know what they would have done. But the only reason I looked at it differently was because I had that thought.
Right.
Yeah.
And our last question, I think this is a good question to end on. Is how do you convince people to change processes they've been using for a long time in order to meet new and changing needs?
Got to make it better. Because if the new way is too difficult, they're going to fall back to the old way, and we are all guilty. So remember those mental models. If you're not improving on something and making it easier for them, they're not going to do it. And that is not just your clients. If you're honest, it's all of us. If it's not easy, if it's not as easy or better, they're not going to switch up their way. So what is it that is the barrier for them to switch? So you got to think about that. And then there is a contingent who, I was in the store the other day and somebody was writing a paper check, and I thought, you don't see that very often. You know, so, you know, some people just aren't going to be able to make that switch. But if you've designed something for persona and you can get, you know, 11 out of 12 people who see that it's easier to use, serves their purposes, they will do it. But you got to make it usable. Human sense usable.
Oh, I'm sorry. I think the actual original intent of the question was more about how do you get them to adopt this process?
Yeah, fantastic question. Ask indulgence, pick a project, start to set this up, work the kinks out, a small project, work the kinks out, get people on board. Once you see and you get in a cadence of how this works, you will never go back again. And I also think, you know, remind people, you know, we do this for websites. We do this for, you know, new clinical processes. We wouldn't build a house without talking to the client and creating a blueprint, right? We wouldn't just all of a sudden build a car. Like, these things require a process. The idea that this doesn't is just not true. It does, but start small, pick a small project, start to establish a process, show a good outcome, and grow your practice.
Great. That sounds fantastic. Thank you so much, Denny. I'll hand back to you for any final thoughts.
Well, Kathy, I want to thank you and HealthDataViz. These are always great discussions, and you know, making something complex intuitively obvious to the casual observer is not a technical exercise, as you've pointed out. It's a communication effort, it's a planning effort, it's an organizational effort, and it's a very social effort, which is often difficult for those of us who are used to immersing ourselves in the quantitative world. The 3D world of human interaction that makes this work is sometimes the last thing that some of us are inclined to do when we've created what we think is our masterpiece, our data visualization masterpiece. But as you pointed out, and as I especially greatly appreciate, you know, the work is in the work. It's in the, you know, this is as much to understand as I interpret and internalize your presentation. This is as much to understand about the mental models we bring to our work as it is to the mental models that our users will bring to the work we do for them. And I always find this a very, very stimulating and thought-provoking discussion. You have moved beyond some of the data standards that you've set before and are talking much more about design thinking and visualization, which reflects that your firm has evolved as well, which is very, very exciting. I want to thank everybody who's attended today, and we will have a recording of today's presentation available in the next 72 hours. We encourage your questions. We welcome you to participate with us in the consortium and our events. And as Kathy Rowell and HealthDataViz, being one of the members of our consortium for many years, we would like you and your organizations to join us as well if you haven't already. But with a great thanks to you, Kathy, and to your team, at HealthDataViz. And to those of you who have joined us today, I want to thank you for your time, and we're adjourned.
Thanks for the opportunity. Have a great week, everyone.
Bye, Kath.
Bye-bye.